Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and to our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. Of course, we welcome those who join us on all of these occasions on our heritage.org website and those who will be joining us on a future date on C-SPAN Book TV. We, of course, ask here in-house that you check that cell phones have been turned off as we prepare to begin, and remind our internet and televised viewers that you are welcome to send questions or comments to us at any time, simply emailing speaker@heritage.org. And of course, we will post this program on our Heritage website for your future reference as well. We're pleased today to feature the book Prodigal Press. Our guest has several copies available and some other publications that you may find of interest. They will all be available for purchase and signing following our program just outside here in the lobby. 25 years ago, as a teacher of journalism history at the University of Texas, Dr. Marvin Olasky first authored and published the book Prodigal Press, Confronting the Anti-Christian Bias of the American News Media. Now serving as editor-in-chief of World News Group, Dr. Olasky teamed up with our guest today, Warren Cole Smith, to update this text to address what we all recognize as a sea change in American media as a result not only of internet reporting activities, but our now 7-day, 24-hour news cycle. Warren Cole Smith serves as the associate publisher of World Magazine, as well as publisher and editor of World News Service. His essays, reviews, interviews, and articles have also been included in various books, including Public Relations, one of the world's most widely used college journalism textbooks. We're pleased to welcome Warren to Heritage today and look forward to his presentation. Warren?
Thank you. Thank you, John. It's great to be with you today and with the other good folks at Heritage, Jennifer Marshall, Senator Jim DeMint. Appreciate y'all's hospitality very much today. We will be talking about Prodigal Press, confronting the anti-Christian bias of the American news media. As John said, Dr. Marvin Olasky wrote this book originally 25 years ago, and it's been widely used in college classrooms around the country, but much has happened in the past 25 years. The 24/7 news cycle that John referred to is, of course, facilitated at least in part by the internet. When the original book, Prodigal Press, was written and published in 1988, the internet, I'm fond of saying, was merely a gleam in Al Gore's eye at that time. But since then, of course, the internet is really driving what happens in the news cycle. So we felt like it was due for an update. We started working on this book about 3 years ago, and it was just published in September. We've been delighted by the reception of the book so far. And what I'm going to do today is to just share with you some of the ideas that are in this book. I want to talk a little bit about World News Group, just to kind of give you an idea of who we are, even though John did a great job of setting me up on that score. And also, I want to be really clear that my purpose today is not to bash the mainstream media. I do not in any way, shape, or form consider the mainstream media or the what some people call the legacy media as the enemy. I do believe, however, that we are in the midst of a sort of a pathological media culture, and that some of the ideas that I'm going to share with you today, I hope, will allow us to identify some of those pathologies, and then ultimately perhaps even to find a way out of that pathology and provide hope for the future, as you can see here. First, a few words, if you'll allow me, a point of personal privilege about World News Group. We're the largest Christian news organization in the country. We have World Magazine, which has about 400,000 readers. We come out 26 times a year. We also have a robust presence on the internet, about 500,000 to 600,000 unique visitors a month to our website, over 2 million page views. Beginning about 2 years ago, we also started a radio program called The World and Everything in It. It's a 2-hour weekend program and a 30-minute daily program. For those of you who are used to listening to things on Christian radio, you will discover that it is not anything like what is on Christian radio. It sounds much more like National Public Radio than it does anything that you would normally hear on Christian radio. Nick Eicher and Joseph Slife are the two co-hosts of that program, and they've been doing an excellent job with it. Starting after the first of the year, we're going to start a new 30-minute interview program that I will host. And once again, it's not really patterned after anything on Christian radio, but think Charlie Rose or Fresh Air with Terry Gross, and you'll have a little bit more of an idea of what we're trying to create with our radio presence. We also have a World on Campus website, which is targeted towards young people, and a whole range of age-specific children's publications that are widely used in the Christian school and the homeschool community. Well, I'd like to begin by just sharing what for many of you will be obvious, and that is that mass media is dominant in our culture today, and it has a profound impact on the way we think. The average young person will spend about 54,000 hours with some form of mass media before they reach their 17th birthday. Now, compare and contrast that to the amount of time that the average young person might spend in church. Even if you go to church every day, 52 weeks, or every Sunday, 52 weeks a year, for your entire growing up time, you will spend less than 1,000 hours in church. So now that doesn't necessarily mean that one is having less or more of an impact than the other. That's just a matter of how much time you spend with them. Some of the time we spend with mass media is passive. But I think that these numbers really sort of put into sharp relief at least the amount of time that we spend with these various influences on the way we think. And I think it's would probably be a little bit disingenuous to claim that that massive amount of time has no impact on us whatsoever. In fact, Senator Joseph Lieberman, who many of you know was no doctrinaire conservative, he was a Democrat and then later an independent senator, said this: more than 3 decades of research has firmly established that electronic media have a powerful influence on the attitudes, values, and behavior of America's children. This influence has grown only larger as the amount of time that young people spend consuming media has grown greater. I don't think any of us would argue with that, and that's one of the ideas that we begin to explore in Prodigal Press, is how the content of the media shape the way we think. We also look at how the media themselves shape the way we think. But let's take a look at content first. I'd like to begin often my presentations about the content in the news media and how much it has changed over the years by saying I want to share with you the story of a great Christian newspaper. That newspaper is the New York Times. Now, if you read the New York Times today, you don't think of it as a Christian newspaper, but in fact, it was founded by Henry Raymond, a Bible-believing Presbyterian Christian in the 1850s. In the 1870s, one of his star investigative reporters, a man named Augustus St. Clair, went undercover in the abortion facilities of New York. Some of you today may have heard of folks like Lila Rose or James O'Keefe, who has gone undercover with video cameras into Planned Parenthood and other facilities and posted these videos on the internet. And that has been touted as an innovative use of social media and modern technologies to do investigative reporting. But in fact, that was being done by the New York Times in the 1870s. The Times passionately opposed abortion in its both editorial pages and news coverage, calling it infant murder and saying the practice is rank and smells to heaven. In fact, one abortionist that was exposed by the New York Times actually ended up spending 7 years in prison as a result of those stories. And the New York Times was not alone. Between 1825 and 1845, as Marvin Olasky documented in the original version of this book, Prodigal Press, over 100 cities and towns across America had explicitly Christian newspapers, including the Boston Recorder, edited by a man named Nathaniel Willis, one of the most interesting and lively publications of its era. During that same period, New York City alone boasted 52 magazines and newspapers that called themselves explicitly Christian. But, of course, we know that the New York Times is Christian no more. The Times of today regularly editorializes in favor of same-sex marriage and abortion, two ideas that most evangelical Christians find abhorrent. Recent Times columnist Thomas Friedman equated the Tea Party with Hezbollah, and fellow Times columnist Joe Nocera did him one better, saying that the Tea Party Republicans have waged jihad on the American people. Now, whether you agree or disagree with Thomas Friedman and Joe Nocera, I think that you would have to agree that calling Tea Party Republicans jihadist reflects a certain tone deafness when it comes to theological distinctives. So we begin to, see that that religious coverage, use of religious language in newspapers, in anything that resembles a knowing usage, has dramatically deteriorated, not just in the New York Times, but in other publications as well. So much so that to the point where Jill Abramson, who became the first female editor of the Times in 2011, said this: "In my house, the Times substituted for religion. It was the absolute truth." So again, we see how far the New York Times has come within a 150-year period, and I think it's fair to say that that's what's happened at the Times is fairly indicative is what has happened in many other publications. Well, to highlight all of the reasons for this change would cause us probably to be here for days, and besides, I'm here to talk about the book, and we have documented much of this in the book, but I would simply say that there's been a lot of cultural, technological, and political changes that have taken place over those 150 years. In other words, there wasn't a switch that went on or off that caused the mainstream media to go from a fundamentally religious worldview to one that is fundamentally irreligious, or at least not religious today. But it's been a wide variety of events and changes in our culture that have occurred during that period of time. Some specific events that we talk about in some detail in Prodigal Press are the rise of transcendentalism. Most of us remember from our high school English courses, maybe we've tried to forget over the years, but we might remember, Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau and Nathaniel Hawthorne and other of the transcendentalist writers. What we might forget about those folks is that they were also men of letters in the public square as well. They were not ivory tower theorists, that they were writing in the newspapers and magazines of their day. The progressive era of the late 19th century also ushered in what some would call yellow journalism, some would call a golden age of journalism, but it's an era from which we remember names like Horace Greeley, who said, "Go West, young man," or Joseph Pulitzer, who the Pulitzer Prize was named after. And then coming forward into the 20th century, men like William Randolph Hearst, whose Hearst newspaper chain and magazine empire, media empire, of course, is still around today, and was the subject, by the way, of the movie Citizen Kane, which has been called one of the great movies of all time, but it also really painted William Randolph Hearst or Kane, was it John Foster Kane in that movie, as a man who was really dislocated from a sense of purpose and meaning in his life, so much so that at the end of the movie he died alone and sad. And so we begin to see that as we march through the 20th century, the Scopes-Muckey trial of 1925, which was covered by the leading journalist of the day, H.L. Mencken, and really pitted. It wasn't just a coverage of a trial, but it was a worldview that was on trial as well. And H.L. Mencken made that abundantly plain in his coverage, that it was the Christian worldview versus a progressivist, materialist, scientific worldview that was really in the dock, and not John Scopes, the teacher who was teaching Darwinism at that time. And then moving forward even further, the Whittaker Chambers Alger Hiss trial, which took place around 1950. Again, if you've read Whittaker Chambers' autobiography, Witness, you know that trial was not just a trial about Whittaker Chambers and communism, but it was really a trial of worldviews. It pitted the atheistic worldview of communism versus the theistic worldview that Whittaker Chambers had come to embrace over the course of his life. It also, by the way, put what was then a relatively inconsequential small backwater newspaper on the map. That newspaper, of course, is the Washington Post, which covered that trial extensively and had its coverage picked up around the country. And was because it was also a trial of New Deal ideas, it really established the Washington Post as a leading liberal progressivist newspaper of the late 20th century. Well, all of these factors and more go into creating a media that we have today, so much so that by 1986, Robert and Linda Lichter, a husband and wife team, along with Stanley Rothman, their collaborator, were able to write a book called The Media Elite, in which they found, after extensive surveying, that journalists were well to the left of the general public on a wide range of ideas, and not just on the culture war ideas that we think about today, like abortion and homosexuality, but also on ideas such as affirmative action and energy policy as well. Fast forward another 15 or so years, and we come to Jim Kuyper's study. Jim Kuyper is a professor at Virginia Tech University, and he did a survey of 116 newspapers and found that media tend to operate within a fairly narrow range of liberal beliefs. In other words, not only are they liberal, but their range of contacts and range of the range of views that they represent in their stories tends to be within a fairly narrow range as well. The other thing that Jim Kuyper said that was really interesting is that they tended to omit reasonable and diverse conservative voices and highlight the more radical liberal voices. I think that is one of the reasons why whenever folks like that pastor in Florida who burned the Koran, or the pastor from Fred Phelps of Westboro Baptist Church will protest at the funerals of servicemen, those stories get picked up because they're loud and they're shrill, but they are not representative of the overwhelming majority of either conservative or Christian people in this country. But because most liberal journalists don't have an extensive Rolodex of conservative and evangelical contacts, then they just tend to gravitate to the ones that they hear the most about. So it creates a flawed and a skewed vision of the number of people who hold liberal and Christian views, but also just the range of those views and the reasonableness of those views as well. A study by the American Enterprise Institute found results that were consistent with these surveys that I just mentioned. Between 10 and 15% fewer positive stories occurred in the media whenever there is a Republican in the White House. And so what we end up here, when you take all of this together, is a vision of a mainstream media that is creating a meta-narrative that ends up being biased in favor of liberal and anti-Christian ideas. This is important because being in control of that public narrative, sometimes called the meta-narrative by theorists, really does matter. In fact, I saw an example graphically of how just minor changes to a story can make a difference. Or let me begin by, before I show you those pictures, just mention this. One of the reasons this is important is because Robert Webber, a theologian, said that the most pressing spiritual issue of our time is who gets to narrate the world. Who narrates the world and how they narrate it really does matter in the way we think and in the way public policy decisions get made. And now that photograph that I wanted to share with you, storytelling, great storytelling can elicit a powerful reaction, but who holds the camera in this case really does matter. Very small changes can make a big difference. So I think we see this every day in the mainstream media, that these changes are subtle, or these differences are subtle, but they really do make a powerful difference in the ultimate narrative that gets told to the American people. So content matters. And what is in the media can shape the way we think. I'd like to shift gears a little bit and spend the next couple of minutes, though, also talking about the media themselves, the technology that is used and how that has changed, and how those changes also affect the way we think and the way we process ideas. So the question that I would pose to you is the one on the screen. Have modern media, technology, and culture actually eroded our ability to think, especially to think deeply about complex issues and ideas, which are the very basis of a Christian and a conservative worldview? Now, many people who have thought deeply about these questions say the answer to that question is indeed yes. One of them is Neil Postman, who wrote a powerful book that had a big influence on my life that we quote extensively in Prodigal Press, called Amusing Ourselves to Death. What Neil Postman says is that all media have limited abilities, and there are certain things that they're just not able to do. Postman's famous metaphor was smoke signals, where he said that smoke signals can communicate to you, for example, that I exist, might even communicate to you where I am, and that I have a desire to communicate with you. But it doesn't communicate much more than that. You don't know much about my philosophy, my theology, my loves, my hates, my desires, my fears, because of my smoke signals. Smoke signals just do not have the capacity to communicate those ideas. Postman goes on to say that all media have certain limitations, and that it's important for us to understand what a particular medium can communicate, but also what the limitations of that medium are. The other thing that Postman said was that all media, especially new technology, tend to, the benefits, the positive aspects of that technology tend to show up first, and the negative aspects of a technology tend to show up later. I've come to call that the happy hour effect. And if you walk by a bar at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the sign on the bar doesn't say, "Come in and we will take all of your money and make you stupid and cause you to make bad decisions later in the evening that you will regret for the rest of your life." If that was the sign on the door, nobody would go into the bar, right? So the sign on the bar instead says what? It says happy hour, because it wants to communicate to you the positive benefits first, rather than, and the negative benefits tend to show up later. That's true of any new technology. We don't embrace a new technology like a laptop computer or an iPhone or any other of the wonderful technologies that we've embraced because of the negative consequences that might show up in our lives as a result of that. We know, for example, now that many people die every year. Literally thousands will die this year because of texting while driving, distracted driving because of their cell phones. Now, if we were told that that was the primary consequence of owning a cell phone, that we would die at the wheels of our car, we would never embrace that technology. We embrace new technologies because it offers benefits to us, and they are real benefits. I'm not saying that they're not real benefits, but there are also costs. Neil Postman says that we should always evaluate a technology based not on just the benefits, but on what he calls the net cost or the net benefits of any technology. A great example of that showed up in the news a couple of years ago, and I've come to call it the story of the Facebook burglar, and it gives you an idea of what net effect looks like. A woman whose house was robbed posted a security camera video on her Facebook profile, and because of that video, the burglar was identified and arrested. If this is all you know about that story, you would think, well, this is a fantastic use of technology, right? It was a fantastic use of the video camera, it was a fantastic use of Facebook, fantastic use of the internet generally. But if you know the rest of the story, you might come to a different conclusion. It turns out that this robber was a Facebook friend of the victim, and that he learned that the woman would be out for the evening because of her updates on her Facebook profile. So the rest of the story really communicates that the effect of Facebook on this woman's life was not an unmitigated positive, as just knowing the first part of that story might suggest. Another great thinker, in addition to Neil Postman, is Marshall McLuhan, who wrote a famous book called Understanding Media. He's probably best known for his idea, the medium is the message. He communicated that idea using a metaphor that is sometimes called McLuhan's light bulb. And McLuhan's light bulb basically says that imagine you walk into a dark room, it's completely pitch black, and you don't know what's in the room. What would your behavior be? McLuhan says that your behavior would be guarded. That you might have fear, that the way you walked around in that room, the way you communicated to who might be in that room would be a certain way. If the light suddenly came on in that room and you could see what was in that room, your behavior would completely change. You would see what was in the room. If it was a room like this, I would see that there were no threats in the room, that all the happy faces here are, are friends of mine and not enemies of mine. My behavior would completely change. My attitude would completely change. My posture would completely change. McLuhan asked the question, but what changed about the room? Did the contents of the room change? He would say, no, not one bit. It was the medium by which we experienced the room that changed from darkness to light. And that's one of the reasons why Marshall McLuhan said the medium is the message. And but media compel a certain behavior, whether we want that behavior to be indicative of who we are or not. I sometimes, when I'm talking to young people, use the example of the Lord of the Rings, the contrast of the book and the movie. For those of you who might be Lord of the Ring geeks, then you would know who Aragorn is in Lord of the Rings. Aragorn has a lot of names in Lord of the Rings. He's son of Arathorn, for example, which gives you an idea of his lineage and his heritage and background. He's called Strider. Which tells you something about his physical abilities. He's not an ambler or a stroller. He's a strider, right? And he's also a ranger, which is an office, and a ranger is someone who is a protector. So as J.R.R. Tolkien writes the book, these names for Tolkien unfold, and we begin to interact with the text on the page and build a picture in our mind of who Aragorn, son of Arathorn, the future king, will be. But if you've seen the movie, which, by the way, I really like, I think the movies are wonderful in many ways, but the vision of who Aragorn is and all the other characters in The Lord of the Ring are dictated by the director, Peter Jackson. And whatever picture that I might have of Aragorn in my own mind tends to get swamped, overwhelmed by the picture that the movie producer wants me to have of Aragorn, which looks a lot like Viggo Mortensen to me. So media, in other words, have the power to manipulate and to confuse us. It has the ability, producers in the media, whether they are journalists or movie producers or record producers, can impose their view on us rather than allowing us to actively collaborate and participate with the world to come up with our understanding and our view of what the world looks like. So what can we do about it? And I will close with this and let you guys ask me some questions about the book and about some of the ideas. What can we do about it? Well, I think one of the things that we can do is we should stand for and with what has sometimes been called the good, the true, and the beautiful, and stand for and with those who produce the good, the true, and the beautiful. At World Magazine, we think a powerful tool for doing that is what we call biblical storytelling. Biblical storytelling is the process of using Scripture as our standard of truth and using a biblical norm, which is storytelling, to make that truth come alive. So, for example, it would not be enough to say that abortion is bad if you, for example, believed that abortion is bad. But it would be more powerful, more effective to tell stories of women, of children, of families, of communities that abortion has impacted, and tell the consequences, or rather show and not just tell the consequences of those of abortion or whatever it is that you're trying to show the consequences of. And I also want to be clear that we don't think that technology is bad. I mean, clearly, my presence here today is an indication that it is not. I'm using a PowerPoint presentation. We're streaming this presentation live on the internet, and many viewers, we pray, will watch this on C-SPAN, yet another kind of technology. So all technology is not bad. In fact, we don't think technology is bad at all. We should use all the technological tools that God in His good providence has made available to us, but we should, as Neil Postman said, be aware of both their abilities and their limitations. We must be discerning consumers of technology so that we are not manipulated by both the abilities and the limitations of those technologies. Well, I'm going to hold this closing story after to the Q&A, and if you'll again indulge me a couple of minutes at the end of the presentation to close with this. But I'd like to just pause now and and see if there are any questions that you might have. And John, do you have some ground rules for the question and answer
Very
session?
simple ground rules. If you'll just wait for the microphone, and if you do not mind at least identifying yourself as a courtesy to the speaker, and I'm going to take the opportunity to ask you the first question.
Okay, great.
I noticed that you keep talking about journalism, and of course I think about Marvin Olasky and a journalism school. Journalists used to be, like the diary, writing down what they observed today. Then they crossed the line of, I feel bad. Then they crossed the line of, maybe we should feel bad. Then we've gotten to the point where even before the story is released, particularly in Washington, the talking points, the PR campaign has begun so we can tell you what you're going to read before you read what you're going to read. Is there any mechanism for getting around that?
Yeah. Well, that's a great question, and that to me is part of this pathological media landscape, this pathological media culture that we're in. Is there a way to get around it? I think that Pandora's box has been opened. I think the cat is out of the bag. I don't think that we can go back to a pre-24/7 news cycle, which is a part of the reason this exists. And if I could just back up, I do think that often it's not malicious intent on the part of people that create this environment. Sometimes it is malicious intent, but I think often it's it's a function of the fact that now instead of a couple of news networks, we have 10 or 12 news networks. Instead of 30 minutes at with Walter Cronkite at 6:30 in the evening, we have 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year that these cable networks have to fill. It becomes a real tyrant, this 24/7 news cycle. So they have to fill it. There's not enough. I'm not going to say there's not enough news, because there's plenty of news in the world, but there's not enough reporting capability. So they fill it with punditry. And I think that that's a big part of it. I think the ultimate solution to that, though, is in the hands of the consumer. We've got to stop rewarding that kind of behavior. We've got to reward with both our readership and our viewership and our financial resources those organizations that are actually putting reporters on the ground and doing real reporting and not just resorting to punditry in the studio. And usually, by the way, those studios are in places like Washington and New York and Los Angeles. They are not in places like where I live, Charlotte, North Carolina, flyover country, the red states in America. So,
audience questions.
Yes.
Thanks.
Jennifer Marshall here at Heritage. World is quite explicit about its worldview with which it reports, and it seeks to illuminate the worldview at play in any story or editorial. Can you comment on other media, how much disclosure of worldview you think goes on? Do you see differences between print and broadcast and online in that regard, with how illuminating they are, both of their own worldview and the worldviews at stake in their coverage?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, because you're right. World Magazine is explicitly Christian in our worldview, and other media claim to be fair and balanced or objective or whatever language that they want to use. We've got an entire chapter in Prodigal Press that we actually had to revise fairly extensively for this version, because things have changed so much in that very area that you're talking about in the last few years. Where in 1988, the media were very subjective. There was a very clear bias in the media, but it was for the most part a disguised bias. We called it disguised subjectivity in the book. Now we have moved into an era where there is just completely undisguised subjectivity. I would use just MSNBC as an example. Some of you might remember that that the Barack Obama campaign used the slogan "Forward" as part of its campaign branding, if you will. And you might remember that about that same time, MSNBC went through a rebranding process. And do you know what slogan it now uses on that network? Does anyone know? Well, not Forward, but lean forward, right? So I'm not saying that there's an explicit complicity between the Obama campaign and MSNBC, but I am simply saying that it reflects a commonality of worldview, and that there are now we now live in an environment where most of the news networks are much more explicitly either conservative or liberal in their point of view. I would also say that even those that won't cop to the plea of being liberal are because of some of the things that we just talked about. The lack of sources that they actually have on the right, and the ability and willingness to paint conservatives stereotypically or in a manner of a caricature, that even those that are at least pretending to some level of balance usually end up skewing pretty heavily on the liberal side. This goes back 40 years, but I can't resist telling this little anecdote. Pauline Kael was the legendary film reviewer for the New Yorker magazine, and when Richard Nixon got reelected president in 1972 with one of the greatest landslides at that time in American history, Pauline Kael reportedly said, "Nixon, I don't know anybody who voted for Nixon." Now, she was probably telling the truth. She probably didn't know anyone who voted for Nixon, even though the vast majority of Americans did. So that, again, is just a sort of an example or an anecdote that indicates just what a bubble most people in the mainstream media, most journalists in the mainstream media live in, and they just don't know what's going on outside that bubble. And that's only gotten worse over the years. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Dave Price, retired journalist and educator. I'm going to try to tie my question into both of those. When I started in journalism back in the 70s, of course, it was newspapers, what I dealt with. And there were pages. The front page was supposed to be news, of course, with this disguised objectivity, and the editorials. And I think part of what you pointed out is this blend where today people have a hard time distinguishing between editorial, punditry, news. It's all kind of thrown together, whether it's on the internet or in there. What role, if any, do you see education playing in separating, and I would apply it to your own organization. I mean, you're very clear. You have a Christian belief. You have a Christian, somebody might say bias, but you're coming from a point of worldview that informs everything that you do and you believe in. So what is the role of education today, in your mind, of letting people know the differences between this is what should pass as news, this is opinion, this is something else? Yeah.
Well, I think the role of education is huge. Unfortunately, I don't think that it is likely that the mainstream educational institutions of this country are going to be able to rise to that challenge. That for example, there are almost no journalism schools in Christian colleges in America. There are the only graduate program in journalism at a Christian college that I know of. There may be others, is at Regent University, and if you want to teach at the college, if you want to teach journalism at the college level, you have to have a graduate degree in journalism. So at least usually, you have to have it's usually in journalism. So it's unlikely that someone coming up within that system that's getting educated in the mostly liberal, mostly secular higher education system in this country is suddenly going, light bulb is going to go off, and they're going to have a worldview that is any different other than the one that for the last 20 or 25 years that in which they've been indoctrinated. So education should play a huge role, but from the very earliest stage, we put our kids in public school systems, we put them in public universities. Our journalists in particular end up going to public institutions that are secular, that don't have a Christian worldview. So it's pretty unlikely that those institutions are going to change that pattern. Yes, sir.
Quenny, I'm a citizen journalist with Watchdog Wire. Certainly there's, rivals when it comes to worldviews. Could you talk about Fox News versus CNN and contrast that to Christian Broadcast Network? Thank you very much.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Fox News is not Christian in its orientation. I'll say that. And you know, the Christian, what the Christian Broadcast Network is doing. I'm not terribly familiar with it. I mean, I think it's a step in the right direction, perhaps, but it is not, the Christian Broadcast Network, Fox News, is not nearly enough to combat the overwhelmingly secular and liberal worldview that we see on virtually every other news network that's out there. And the resources of both of those organizations combined would amount to only probably a small fraction of the news gathering capabilities that you would find at, say, a place like NBC. So, you know, there's just, you know, without making any sort of specific judgments or criticism about the Christian Broadcasting Network or Fox, I will just simply say that whatever they are doing that is good is inadequate for the needs of the day. Yes, sir.
Dave Russell serves as the director for campus outreach at college ministry here in town. Westboro Baptist Church. So you commented a little bit about these kind of radical voices being highlighted.
Yeah.
Despite them being just a couple families, really being no more Baptist than the Ku Klux Klan as a Christian ministry, they're always making the news. Could you talk a little more about why news editors might deem them newsworthy, why their voices get highlighted so much?
Well, you know, I think it's a combination of ideology and practicality. The ideology is simply that I don't think that most folks in the mainstream media have the theological training and tools and temperament and background to be able to tell the difference between, you know, Fred Phelps and Westboro Baptist Church and Rick Warren at Saddleback Church. I mean, I think they might say, yes, superficially that there is some sort of a difference, but I just think that for the most part, they don't get the difference. They don't understand what those differences are for the most part. They're just, you know, again, it's not maybe animosity, it's just a complete lack of understanding, the inability to discern those subtle differences. And again, that's a part of the training. I mean, if I'm a science reporter for National Public Radio, it is inconceivable that I would get hired for that job without having some sort of a science background. And yet journalists every day cover stories, not just beat religion reporters, but I'm talking about all reporters, cover issues every day that have a religious or a moral or ethical component to them, and they don't have any training in these areas. So I think part of it is that they just don't have the antenna to discern the difference. And I think another part is the practicality of it, where they will, if these guys are putting out press releases, if they are, you know, videotaping what they're doing and making their videotape available, if they are making it easy for the media to cover them, especially visual media, television, electronic media, by staging demonstrations and holding up signs that say God hates fags on them. Those become compelling visuals that the mainstream media too often can't resist. You know, you see it at the local level where, you know, you turn on virtually any local television news network and, there, you know, you see come to pass that old saying, if it bleeds, it leads, right? They cover a lot of car wrecks, they cover a lot of fires because they make compelling visuals, because there's a lot of flashing lights, because there's a lot of yellow police tape there. It looks good on television. So I think that there's just sort of that practical aspect of it. The other side of it, too, is that, you know, I think that there often is some animosity. The idea that Fred Phelps is representative of mainstream evangelical Christianity plays into many people's narratives of what evangelical Christianity is all about, even though it is completely not true. It's what they want to believe. It's their bias and their prejudice, so they will continue to cover folks like Fred Phelps or that Koran burning pastor down in Florida and ignore many reasonable evangelical voices who have thought deeply about some of the same issues that they're covering.
As a footnote too, how much of journalism, though, in the media, when I was growing up, I thought of it as partly a public service that they did as part of their overall broadcasting. Nowadays, it's Where is the profit line? If there's no profit line, we don't need to do the news. We need to do the gotcha moments.
Yeah, well, that's a really great question. I'm not clear, John, that has changed a whole lot. I mean, if you look at William Randolph Hearst, for example, I mean, he became one of the wealthiest men in the history of the planet. Long before. The modern news era. In fact, you might even say he initiated the modern news era. But I do think it's that you're right, that it allows me to sort of segue in another interesting point. A lot of interesting journalism these days is now coming out of nonprofit organizations. Within the secular arena, you have organizations such as the Center for Public Integrity or the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which owns or not the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, because that's a government-funded organization, but organizations like NPR, which is a nonprofit organization that receives funding from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and ProPublica, which is another investigative news organization. These are nonprofit organizations that are privately funded. Now, unfortunately, from my point of view, both CPI and ProPublica tend to be left-leaning in their orientation, and that's where most of their funding comes from. And we don't really have a viable conservative alternative to those types of organizations. But I do think that could be the wave of the future, is that we're going to see more nonprofit journalism, more journalism that's going to be funded by organizations, especially investigative journalism, which tends to be expensive and doesn't always provide an economic return right away, will be funded by these nonprofit organizations. Looked like you had a question. Were you just, no? Okay. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Then your story. Don't forget your story.
Yeah.
Dean Sinclair from Alexandria, Virginia. Early on in your talk today, you talked about the fact that journalists are very much liberal in their political leanings, maybe up 80% or more. Is there something in the system that just draws, liberal people to that kind of profession? Or is there something in the hiring mechanism? What's going on there that makes it so overwhelmingly liberal?
Yeah, well, that's a really good question. I think it goes back in part to the education system that we talked about. Most journalists are being trained in the liberal secular academies of this country, so that's likely going to be what they produce. I should go back, and we have a lot of these statistics in Prodigal Press, but Gallup has been doing a survey since the 1940s about church attendance in America, and that church attendance, while it moves up and down and it has trailed off a little bit in recent years, has stayed around 40%. When Gallup asked the question, have you attended a religious service in the last 7 days, which is a real specific behavioral question, close to 40% of Americans answer yes to that question. When journalists are asked the same question, a variety of surveys have been done on this topic, the number is usually less than 10%. So, you can argue, is that right or is that wrong, is that good or is it bad? I would just simply argue it's different. It is way different than the religious orientation, the religious beliefs and behaviors of journalists just looks really different from the mainstream. And I think that in some ways it becomes either a virtuous cycle or a downward spiral depending upon your orientation. That if all of your friends are liberal, if all of your friends are secular in their worldview and orientation, and you get positive reinforcement from that, then that's just going to create a continuing cycle. It's going to be hard for you to sort of justify or rationalize looking outside your worldview, because you're getting all kinds of affirmation, both professionally and personally within the community in which you are operating. So, any other questions? Do you mind, John, if I close with my story? Well, some of what I've said might lead you to believe that I'm a pessimist, and the truth of the matter is that I'm not. I'm an optimist, and I think that there's a lot of hope for the future. And part of that hope springs from my understanding of history, and that is that God always works through a remnant. There's a continuous cycle throughout history of decline and recovery. One story that I find encouraging, which I'd like to share with you in closing, is the story of the Battle of Britain, which I think probably many of you know. The Battle of Britain began in August of 1940 when the German Luftwaffe started bombing Great Britain. They started bombing Great Britain in part because Hitler wanted to invade Britain and knew that he had to have control of the air. But day after day, the Royal Air Force went up against the Luftwaffe, and we now know, with the hindsight of history, that what Hitler's plans were, and this is from his famous Directive Number 16, and I'm going to just skip down to the last paragraph. The English Air Force must have been beaten down to such an extent, morally and in fact, that it can no longer muster any power of attack worth mentioning against the German crossing. But what we know is that the English Air Force was not beaten down, that despite tremendous destruction, the Royal Air Force exhibited tremendous determination. By the way, I really love that picture because see that dog running out to the airplane with the pilots? I just think that it sort of humanizes that picture a good bit. And we also know that against overwhelming odds, that the Royal Air Force did not exactly prevail against the Luftwaffe, but they were able to battle the Luftwaffe to stalemate in the Battle of Britain, which ended up ending in October of 1940. Leadership, of course, made the difference. Winston Churchill, who was one of the most dramatic figures in 20th century history, said this, you may recall, about the Battle of Britain and specifically the RAF fighters who went up day after day against the Luftwaffe. He said, "Never before in the annals of valor has so much been owed by so many to so few." When I started studying this battle a little bit more closely, when I read a biography of Churchill, I discovered something that for some reason I didn't know before, and that was that the RAF at that time only had 2,000 pilots, that it was only 2,000 pilots that went up every day against the full might of the German Luftwaffe. And when I found out that number, it gave me a lot of encouragement. I believe that journalism is the air war of our time, and so while it is tempting to become discouraged in the face of some of the information and statistics that I might have shared with you, that there's a lot of them and so few of us, I continue to believe that while we may be few in number, with God's help, we will be enough. So thank you very much for your attention today. Thank you, John, and to the Heritage Foundation for hosting me. It's been a pleasure, and I look forward to having lunch with some of you and hanging out for the next hour. Thank you.
And of course, as we mentioned, we do have copies of the 25th anniversary edition of Prodigal Press and some other books in the lobby. Thank you again, Warren, for joining us and for an excellent presentation, and you for your attendance. We will see you hopefully again in the future, not very soon from now. Thank you.